although he's a presbyter or proto-presbyter of the Romanian Orthodox Church, he actually currently works at the Coptic Orthodox Theological College, which is a great display of ecumenism, I think. And he'll be talking on the Philokalia, a brief history of reading well and living beautifully.
Thank you very much. Well, I have actually to apologize. I'm new to this field. I'm not a historian, and it's more of a nationalist drive behind what I present today. Being Romanian, I believe that there's something fundamental that's missing in this whole story that led to the formation of the collection that we call Philokalia or Philokalia. I still try to find my bearing in this area. So if there'll be inaccuracies or things that I really got very wrong, you must forgive me. Okay, so that's it. Just briefly, what I'll try to address is, first of all, what do we mean by the word Philokalia? Then I'll refer to the famous collection of spiritual texts that span over a millennium, well, somehow, from the 4th century to the 14th century. This collection is known in the Slavic world as Dobrotoljubie. Is it the correct pronunciation? And Philokalia in Greek. Then I'll show how this collection, which is considered by many in Orthodoxy, the standard handbook of spirituality, if you want to put it that way, is actually preceded by a number of similar quests towards rediscovering the roots of Orthodox spirituality. Then this is the nationalist bit, if you like. I'll refer to a part of this history that led to the 18th century collection or collections, which is actually something that has to do with my ancestry. Romanians weren't called Romanians at the time. Yeah, they were called by their ancient name, Dacians or Thracians. But anyway, yeah, so there's something very interesting that's missing, as I said, in the established narrative, namely the fact that this accomplishment of the second half of the 18th century actually has a lot to do with the Romanian context. And then I'll just briefly look at what I call the reverberations of a spiritual movement, because the publication of Philokalia wasn't meant to be just a matter of restitution or retrieval. Let's find out how others were thinking and doing things before our generation. It was a matter of prospectiveness. Let's look at what they did, how they believed, and learn something for today. And in reality, it was a very successful project. So going beyond the academic and kind of archivistic interest. Now, looking at the word, the word either as a verb, philokaleo, or as a noun, philokalia, is ancient, and it refers to basically to things, on the one hand, love for things that are beautiful. Collectors, for instance, could use this word, but also a matter of scholarship. Look at pearls of ancient literature and collect those, gather those, assess those pearls, you know, find out their value. So these are the two main meanings of this root, loving, you know, philo, the verb, and kalos, which means beauty. But things aren't very simple with the second word, kalos. Kalos doesn't mean in Greek only beautiful, and we had a conversation earlier today in the previous session here about beauty and goodness, aesthetics and ethics. And I believe that this word, either the verb or the noun, refer to both aspects. It's not about looking at beautiful things the way the collectors would do today. It's a matter of trying to discover, find out those beautiful things that are so because of their intrinsic ethical, spiritual value, or in the case of the Byzantine collection of spiritual writings, formative value. I think a better word for this whole quest of discovering things that are beautiful and good is actually what you see on the slide as the third term there, which was used already in classical Greece, philokalic. It contains both words, kalos, taken as beautiful, agathos, taken as good. I believe that this word, which was still used by some early Christian fathers in the Greek tradition, is more interesting from the viewpoint of the content and the purpose of the collection known as Dobrotoljubie or Philokalia. Now, looking at the actual collection, the word Philokalia, which appears in its very title, and I'll turn to the title in a minute, tries to encapsulate both aspects of goodness and beauty, but also the aspect of collection. So it was on purpose the desire of certain people, and the 18th century is more like a culmination of the entire process. A desire to discover those sources that can lead to a beautiful life, which means in this context a spirituality that is embodied and has transformative dimensions. In reality, the readers of such literature were supposed not only to get informed about how previous generations would think about the spiritual life. The outcome of this entire inquiry was actually personal transformation, and I have written down there two more words which refer to this outcome. Someone who would love beauty or goodness or both would end up by being transformed into the object of contemplation. So you look at those texts that speak about how to get there, and you learn from those texts how to do, what to do in order to get there, and in the process of learning and applying that kind of wisdom, you are transformed. You become what you behold. Yeah? And this, the concept of beauty and goodness is embodied in the term that is usually applied to monastics, kalogeros or kalogeros. In the feminine it's kalogria, which means beautiful elder. There's a lot that we can speak about beautiful eldership. Russians had, we know from Dostoevsky, the Russians had the famous beautiful elders of Optina monastery. But the same concept is part and parcel of what in the Orthodox tradition we understand by the outcome, the ultimate outcome of the spiritual process, which is a personal transformation into, or embodiment, if you like, into that beauty that was once just beheld from a distance, or read about in beautiful texts. The title of the Greek collection actually says it all. It speaks about how we are supposed to look at these texts that have been collected, as I said, mainly in the 18th century. And for what purpose? For instance, philokaliia, and the first word there in the title, I think should be taken more like a collection. Philokaliia of the holy ones, holy persons who live in watchfulness. Collected from our holy and godly fathers on how the mind is purified, enlightened, and perfected by way of praxis and contemplation which pertain to ethical philosophy. It's a very long title, very complex, not the longest that the Greeks could come up with. But anyway, it's very descriptive, and it shows what this collection was about, what this literature was about. This literature was not informative only. Of course, there is the informative dimension there, but this information was supposed to be appropriated, internalized, to the extent that while studying and trying to make sense of how things worked for the people that have written those things, you were surreptitiously transformed. It happened that in the process, you became what you read about. Of course, this isn't something that should be taken as in put a coin, get a Coke, drink the Coke, and be happy. It's more a matter of immersing oneself in that kind of literature for a long time. So it's not something that you read once and for all and move to the next chapter. It's something that you need to delve into. That's how things are supposed to work. And this is why you see there the Neoplatonic, if you like, concept of mind, nous, which is very important. It's a matter of awareness and volitional kind of undertaking. You really want to change your way of thinking, way of appraising reality, the values, and so on and so forth, and in the process you are enlightened. The problem in this little, from the report of the authors of this kind of literature, is that the mind in its current state is clouded by two veils. One is that of ignorance, the other one is that of one's passions, which misrepresent reality. So in order to see things for what they are, to recognize beauty and goodness in things, for instance, or in people, you need to undertake a process of purification, a change of mind, a change of heart, a change of life, which is actually, look, you can summarize this whole title in repent, the kingdom is at hand. That's it. Well, repent, well, that's the kind of English translation of the word in the Gospel of Matthew. You know? But the literal translation of that verb there, that imperative there, metamoite, would be change your mind. Not repent, change your mind. It's the same root, metamoite, meta, trans, noi from nous, mind. Trans mentality, if you like, that's repent, for the kingdom is at hand. So these people took the gospel literally, if you like, and they tried to make sense of how things should be done in order to undertake that transformation. If you like, it's embodied gospel. That's what Philokalia is all about. And strictly put, this collection that gathers together sources from two traditions, the so-called Hesychast tradition in late centuries of Byzantium, so say from the 11th to the 14th century, and afterwards, of course. But that's the classical age of hesychasm. Spirituality, or a certain kind of spirituality, the quest for serenity, for instance, or as we have in the Latin tradition, equanimitas. Equanimity, a balance of one's heart. You are not moved by emotion, for instance, either fear or joy or pain, or it's balance. This kind of spirituality is known in the Byzantine tradition as hesychast, or that's an English sort of rendition of the word ησυχία, which means serenity, peace. And neptic from nipsis, which means watchfulness. You would have, I think, the closest analogous contemporary spirituality would be awareness, to be always present, aware of what's going on within you, around you. That's a photocopy of the first edition of the Greek Philokalia in 1782. Just to show how things looked like. That translation of the title belongs to me. I try to be as precise as possible, because in more modern renditions of this collection, in reality, this subtitle, the whole subtitle, is missing. They just say the Philokalia full stop, but they don't explain what's that. And so it's.
So what's missing?
For instance, the English version of this book, which was translated, I'll come to it in the 80s, has only the title, The Philokalia. Yeah? The subtitle is missing altogether. As though you're already supposed to know ancient Greek and know what Philokalia means. Yeah? Or how this word was supposed to be, or is supposed to be understood today. I believe that subtitle is very important. But let's look at what happened then in the 18th century. In 1743, a young Ukrainian monk, Paisi Velichkovsky, arrived in what nowadays is known as Romania, where he joined an elder, Saint Basil of Poiana Vălui, that's a place in Romania, a monastery, and that spiritual elder was also Ukrainian by birth. Why Ukrainians flocked those days towards Romania? That's something that I'll try to answer later on. St. Basil of Poiana was himself practicing hesychast, so someone that was on the path of serenity, praying the so-called Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. That's part of the spiritual exercise, daily spiritual exercise. And also a spiritual writer. His writings are very insightful, being inspired mainly by a 14th century hesychast, Saint Gregory of Sinai, and I think there are identifiable traces from more recent hesychasts, like Saint Nil Sorsky in Russia, or even let's say there. Paisi came in 1743 to meet Basil. Basil possessed a collection of spiritual writings from the Byzantine era, but translated into Slavonic. Now, there's some research going on in Romania now. It seems that what Basil possessed was a Slavonic translation from an earlier Romanian translation of the Greek original. mention the undermining element of history. But both Basil and Paisi realized that they didn't have too many texts. They only possessed a few texts. It was a very limited collection that was there available. So Basil decided to send the younger Paisi to Mount Athos in 1746. Paisi spent there like 20 years collecting manuscripts from the various monasteries of Mount Athos and having them translated into Slavonic. In 1764, Paisi returned to Romania and established himself at quite a beautiful monastery, still existent, Dragomirna. And there he initiated the work on Dobrotoljubie, which means, simply put, love for goodness. Good or goodness. And he had around him hundreds of monks. And what's very interesting, like in the Western Middle Ages, many of them were there because they were intellectuals. They were educated and they could continue the work of translation. There were too many manuscripts. Paisi couldn't handle everything. So he formed this huge monastery where his monks, being educated, could translate from the Greek into Slavonic. But some of them translated already into Romanian. That's very interesting stuff. Anyway, in 1769, one of the disciples of Saint Paisi, monk Raphael, a Romanian person, completed before the Slavonic collection was finalized. So this Romanian monk completed the first Romanian translation of the Philokalia. The manuscript exists. I'll show it to you. Well, I'll show a piece of it later on. But that was momentous, and it's something that should be considered, and it's not in contemporary narratives of how the Philokalia came to be. Later on, Paisi moved to another monastery in Ants, and there at this monastery also existent, Dobrotoljubie was completed and published in manuscript form. Paisi believed that this collection of spiritual writings should not be widely publicized because there was this danger of misinterpreting some of the sayings of the elders and well, going mad or something. That was a real concern. They really believed that if you try to do on your own without guidance, whatever you read there, you could have really gone mad.
Yes.
That was their understanding. His politics was to keep appraised of this collection only months. Well, later, like 10 years or 11 years after Paisi left Mount Athos, comes the Greek story of the Philokalia. Saint Macarius, Bishop of Corinth, who was a hesychast, so one that sought serenity, met a young monk from Samos, or one of the islands, Nicodemus, also interested in the spiritual life, and Macarius already possessed a proto-philokalic collection, the way Basil of Biennial possessed one, and he commissioned Nicodemus to go to the mountain and dig up for more sources. Incidentally, it's very interesting what Nicodemus found in the mountain. Nowadays, the Athenites consider themselves the bastion of Orthodox spirituality and so on and so forth, but then in the 18th century, Nicodemus could not find a hesychast. They didn't even know of these sources. He had to go and retrieve these sources from, I don't know what, forgotten libraries. Yeah, so that, this shows that the tragedy of Orthodoxy under the Ottomans, after the fall of Constantinople, and how badly it was affected not only Orthodox, the Orthodox letters, if you like, but how badly affected was Orthodox spirituality because of the lack of elders and the good literature. The Greeks were quick to have their collection published in 1782 in Venice. This publication was made possible by a Romanian prince of Greek descent, who paid for the whole printing. And later, 1793, the Slavonic Dobrotoljubie of St. Paisi was published in 2 editions, the same year, one in Russia, one in Romania. But this idea of collecting spiritual writings was not new. As I said, during those difficult times under the Ottomans, many seekers of serenity realized that they needed sources, more reliable sources that they had. It wasn't a matter of, finding the ABC of ethics. It was a matter of finding the ABC of a transformative experience. They knew of it. They knew from the lives of the saints that this literature existed, but no one was in possession of larger libraries, so to speak. The prototype of this genre, collecting spiritual gems, is of course the 4th century Philokalia of Origen, compiled by Basil the Great and Gregory the Theologian. Incidentally, Gregory is one of the very few early Christian authors that use the word Philokalia for a number of reasons and in a variety of contexts. I think the first Christian author to use this term, Philokalia, both as collection and as collection of spiritual gems, was Clement the Alexandrian in his multi-volume work, Stramatis, in the 70s. Another form of collecting this kind of spiritual wisdom is, of course, the collection of saints. There's a fathers and mothers, and in reality there are like 3 collections. It's another story. In Byzantium, these early Christian collections were meant to sort of nurture the spiritual life of the monastics, but also later in late Byzantium, they served to legitimize the new form of spirituality associated with Mount Athos, the so-called Hesychast tradition. Post-Byzantine monasteries collected even the writings of the Athenites. So you can see that there's a kind of literary history there. And out of these 2 concerns, to collect earlier and later writings, emerged the tradition of what I call proto-philokalic collections. But they didn't possess too many manuscripts. They were also expensive, but they were not available, first of all. Which were in use in various Hesychast centers, mainly Hesychast centers. Now let's go to the Romanian connection. Hesychasm, as a Byzantine form of spirituality, reached the Romanian lands in the second half of the 14th century, mainly through the disciples of St. Gregory of Sinai. And already a generation or so after him, we have first Hesychast known by the name St. Nicodemus of Ismana Monastery. Before Nicodemus and after Nicodemus, there's evidence of numerous hermitages that appeared throughout the Romanian lands, to the extent that Romanian very early on, well, that's late Middle Ages, Romanian as a language has adopted the Greek word isihastis, hesychast, in the form of sihastro. The word was transformed. There's no other root for this word sihastro or sihastria there. in Greek is isi-hastirion, a place where you seek serenity or find serenity. There have been various elders illustrating this tradition. The most famous are Daniel the Hesychast, the second half of the 15th century, and Saint Theodora of Sivkla, who lived in the second half of the 17th century. The stories about Theodora are amazing. Her accomplishments being likened to those of the famous Byzantine saint Mary the Egyptian, 5th or 6th century. In these isi-hastiria, or monasteries where they were seeking serenity, of course circulated a number of Hesychast manuscripts in Romanian and Slavonic translation. That's how we get to St. Basil's Protopresbyter collection, mentioned in relation to St. Paisi's visit to Romania, and of course the fact that monk Raphael translated the Philokalia even before the Slavonic edition was finalized shows that there was already a tradition. This is something that doesn't pop up out of nowhere. There's a tradition, and I'm certain that Raphael used some earlier manuscripts to get some inspiration. Yeah, I wouldn't see this 1769 Romanian version of the Philokalia as being the first occurrence. And it's also a novelty in the Orthodox camp, because it's the first translation of these Byzantine writings into a modern language, before Russian, before Greek. That's a page from monk Raphael's Philokalia. It's in Romanian, but the letters that were used, the alphabet was Cyrillic. I can read, but I don't understand, for instance, the first word in the temple there. My knowledge of all Romanian is very limited. Curiosului. I don't understand the first word. Curiosului means the one that is a seeker, curious. Curious to know things. I have no idea what the first word means, so I should check a dictionary. But it's Romanian. But the story did not end there. Romanians proved to be very interested in this kind of literature, and in the early 1800s, there's already another collection known as the Philokalia of Neamț, which is an entirely new translation of the collection from the Greek version published in Venice, like 20 years before. But this is appended. It's not just the Greek Philokalia published by St. Macarius and St. Nicodemus. It's appended by other works that for some reason the Greeks have ignored, like the Ladder of Divine Ascent by St. John Climacus and some of the writings of St. Simeon the Theologian. Only in 1857 was Dobrotoljubie translated from the Slavonic into Russian, but its impact was immediate in Ukraine and Russia. And then we have in 1922 another Romanian manuscript. For some reason, the monks continued that kind of mentality of St. Paisi's. We don't make this literature public. Some kind of disciplina arcani. Anyway, so the story continued, and the obsession of the Romanians with this kind of literature and its purpose, I guess, continued with Father Dumitru Stăniloae, the most famous Romanian theologian of last century, who translated a broader pool of writings in 12 volumes, started in 1945, what people would do immediately after the Second World War. But it was a time when Romania needed a spiritual tried to find comfort and guidance in this spiritual literature. We have in 51 beginning a first translation into English. So it's not Romanian connection, but I just want to show you Romanians, when Father Stăniloae started to publish his translation, this was the 4th version in Romanian of the Philokalia, and in English 51, which is a version translated not from Slavonic, not from Greek, from the Russian. And then we have in English the version of 1979-1995, a translation which is largely usable. I don't like that English. Not that it's worse than mine, but it's not the best way of putting things. The Greeks translated into their modern language the whole collection only more recently, 84, 88. Now, in terms of outcomes, it was like an earth-shattering event when the Philokalia was put together and then translated. It caused a real and profound revival of Orthodox spirituality. Immediately after the publication of the Philokalia and its translation into Romanian, we already have an elder, Saint George, of Cernica Monastery, and his disciple, Saint Calinic. Look at the year when George died, 1806. He was possibly one of the distant disciples of Saint Paisi. In Russia, a bit later, with Saint Seraphim of Sarov and Saint Theophan the Recluse, we have the same idea of hesychast life flourishing, and in both cases, Romania and Russia, schools of hesychasts were born out of this movement. In Greece, at Mount Athos, more recently, we have hesychasts like St. Silouan the Athonite. By the way, St. Silouan was Russian, and St. Paisius, Greek background. And there's this very interesting phenomenon happening in the early years after the Second World War, called the Burning Bush Group. It was a mixed group of monks, lay, clergy, scholars, and so on and so forth. They would gather secretly because of the communists at the monastery in Bucharest, and there they would dedicate themselves to prayer, the hesychast prayer, but also to cultural activity. They produced oratorians, poetry, drama, and all that, of course, influenced by the ideals of the hesychast literature. I guess the best known outcomes of the Philokalia in terms of literature, it's the anonymous mid-19th century novel, anonymous novel, The Way of the Pilgrim, largely translated in modern languages, which has influenced in turn Dostoevsky's pages on Elder Zosimas in Brothers Karamazov, and a lesser known work, Salinger's Franny and Zooey. If you're familiar with this tiny booklet, it's amazing. It's a story of transformation. It encapsulates perfectly the message of the Philokalia. Franny is the sister of Zooey, yeah, and she stumbles on the Way of the Pilgrim, that popularization of the Philokalia, and she takes very seriously that kind of literature. And although she's a student, I don't remember now what she was doing, law student or something like that, she begins to transform while reading The Way of the Pilgrim. And from a talkative young girl, you know, beautiful, popular, and all that in America, you have Franny evolving towards a mature, serene, quiet, prayerful person. In the second half of the book, where the main character is Zoe, her brother, he keeps talking, he keeps challenging her, and she's the discreet, silent witness.
Mm.
Okay.
Very good.
Thank you very much. We're running a bit late. We can have very few questions. Any questions?
I'd be
Yes.
interested. I'm actually doing an assignment. I've got to write a course I'm doing here, a essay on ageria. Now, I'm very interested in, because I'm a consecrated person myself, interested, you mentioned women. How involved were women in all this? And see, ageria, you know who she is, the 4th century.
Yeah, I know, the pilgrim, yeah.
Yeah, pilgrim lady.
Yeah.
So, what about the influence of all this on her, and would she have known of this tradition?
Well, it's difficult to say because what we call philokalic tradition begins with writings produced in, say, late 4th century. Chronologically speaking, the first author whose works have been anthologated, collected in the Philokalia, was Evagrius Ponticus. Yeah, so it's difficult to say, but of course, the idea was there.
And then my further question would be, women religious didn't exist at this time, but were there equivalents of women doing what the men were doing?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, you have this, for instance, in the 4th, 5th century literature known as the Saints of the Desert, Egyptian desert. Well, in the Saints of the Desert, the alphabetic collection, there's only 3 female portraits. You won't find more. But there's a book that is available in English called The Forgotten Desert Mothers, where there's a broader collection. But if you're interested in women and the Philokalia, in one of the sources that I used, which is this edited book issued by Oxford University Press in 2012, the Philokalia, a classic text of Orthodox spirituality. There's a chapter there about women and Philokalia. So very, very interesting. They aren't, I mean, no female writer was considered worthy of being included, or her outcomes, her output to be included in the collection. But women aren't absent at all from that universe.
Yeah, well, that's my question. How we're sort of surprised that women like Ageria were able to write and do things that she actually does in the 4th century. I mean, that's a revelation to us. You know, she was writing. The fact that she as a woman was able to write. And also she talks about her sisters. See, it's a new world to us because, you know, we don't, until recently, that wasn't accepted that women were even in that area, writing and living that style of life.
Well, there's a very interesting school now in hagiography. There's a woman in the University of Cyprus, Stavroula Constantinou, who works in this area trying to dig up the female voices that have been somehow marginalized, suppressed at times, you know.
Yeah.
But what she discovered is that they were far from absent, and I read an article by her about nuns that founded monasteries and were able to write what you can call the testaments of the monasteries, or the bylaws of the monasteries, the bylaws of the monasteries. Yeah.
Very quick, one very quick question, yes?
I was just intrigued by what you said about translation, and that you went through a Romanian translation, you went through another translation. That's actually, for us, that would, in modern terms, that would be a distortion. but there it seems to be functioning quite differently as a development. Is there any sense of appreciation within the Philokalia or within the philokalic tradition of this whole idea of a growing translation, a growing, a living active tradition with lived artists?
Yeah, it was, as I said, the work of translation put in motion more than just a scholarly interest. I mean, the people that read the Philokalia were actually people that wrote, added to that literature, not only lived, but also contributed to that kind of literature.
Okay, we'll have to end here. Thank you very much, Biennial.